Okay, this is a video for Year 8 on the transatlantic slave trade. I'm going to be talking about many features of the transatlantic slave trade, from seizure and capture in Africa all the way through to everyday life on a plantation. I won't be talking about the abolition of the slave trade, just because we've got a bit more work to do on that in class, I think, but I may well do a video on it in the future, because it's quite a big topic area that you need to know about. But for now, we're just going to look at features of the transatlantic slave trade before it is abolished. So remember, first of all, I think it's important to remember that slavery exists well before the transatlantic slave trade begins around the 16th century. Okay, we've looked in class at slavery existing in the Greek and Roman era, Arabic slavery. Slavery exists in medieval England before the Normans arrive in 1066. So slavery is not a new thing in the 16th century. It's existed for a long time, but arguably the transatlantic slave trade is the most famous of slavery. Basically, the most famous example. So if you went onto Google and you type the word slave in, images and articles would come up about the transatlantic slave trade more than anything else, I would imagine. Okay, maybe I'm wrong. You might want to try it. So the transatlantic slave trade, what is it? Well, it is a slave trade that begins around the 16th, 17th century, where European people forced millions of Africans into unpaid labour. Okay, so the African people were forced to do it, were forced to work, and they were not paid for their work. They were forced to work for nothing. Now, as we know, the white Europeans justified this by saying that people in Africa were uncivilized. Okay, they were not as advanced as the white Europeans. They were maybe impolite. They were disorganized. That's how the white Europeans justified it. Well, they're uncivilized, and we need to. They should be forced to work. Okay, because they're not as important or as civilized as us. Now we know that this wasn't the case. This wasn't true. It's how they tried to justify it, but it just was not true, because we have looked, Year 8, at several examples of Africa as a civilized continent well before it is colonized by white people. For example, in 300 BC in Kenya, remember that there were ruins in 300 BC found of an observatory to look at the stars. Okay, so in Kenya they found ruins from 300 BC, well before any white Europeans get into that part of Africa. So again, that shows some form of civilization. In Uganda, we know that operations and autopsies were carried out, again, well before Uganda was colonized. So again, that they clearly know stuff about medicine. They're civilized to that degree. In medieval Sudan, there's been evidence found of glass windows. So again, they've clearly learnt how to make glass, which is a complicated process. That shows civilization. That shows that this is not a continent of people, running around in a disorganized, impolite, not very advanced fashion. They are clearly civilized people, but yet the white Europeans try to justify the transatlantic slave trade by saying that the people who live in Africa are not civilized. But as I say, we know that is not true. So what happened to the African people who were forced into slavery? Well, first they were seized, captured in their own country, usually, most commonly, by other African people. Okay, it wasn't a case of white people going in and snatching African people from their villages. Most of the time, it was Africans themselves capturing each other. We looked at the story of Olaudah Equiano, who was kidnapped as a child with his sister. He was then taken eventually to the coast, put on a ship to the West Indies, although he eventually ended up in Virginia in America, modern day America. So that's what happened to the Africans who were seized and captured in Africa. Now this happened to millions of people from Africa. In fact, I've got a fact written down here: between 1650 and 1860, between 10 and 15 million enslaved people were transported from Western Africa to the Americas, North America and South America, or the West Indies, the Caribbean. Now remember that this trade of enslaved people happens as one stage of The slave trade triangle. You should have this written in your exercise book. Okay, it's also in your textbook. There is a diagram of this too. The slave trade triangle. Okay, so you have Europe, Africa, and America and the West Indies, the Caribbean. Okay, it works like this. Manufactured goods which are made in Britain and Europe, such as guns, pots, pans, cloth, things like that, things that are made in Britain and made in Europe, are put on board ships and transported to West Africa. When they reach West Africa, the manufactured goods are traded for captured African people who will become slaves. The slaves are then taken on their leg of the journey or the voyage, known as the Middle Passage. Remember, the Middle Passage is what we refer to as the slaves part of the journey across the Atlantic from West Africa to, as I say, the Americas or the West Indies, the Caribbean. When the ships carrying the slaves reach North or South America or the West Indies, they are then, the slaves, the captured Africans, are then traded for raw materials that are grown in America or the Caribbean that can't be grown in Britain and Europe. Things such as tobacco, cotton, sugar, things like that. Raw materials that are made in the Americas or grown in the Americas and the Caribbean that can't be grown in Britain and Europe. So that's what the captured Africans, the slaves, are traded for. The raw materials then put on board these ships, taken back to Britain or to Europe or wherever, and the whole process starts again. So this triangle is a continuous process of three-way trade, manufactured goods from Britain and Europe, swapped for slaves or captured Africans swapped for these raw materials, the raw materials taken to Britain and Europe. Now the Middle Passage, I'll just put it up again. The Middle Passage, as we've seen, this was a horrendous journey. Enslaved people were put on board ships in awful conditions, really awful conditions, cramped conditions in the hold of the ship, so below the deck. Okay, so it was often very hot, well, it was always very hot and stuffy. They were shackled, so they couldn't move, so tied up in metal handcuffs, essentially, tied down so they could not move. And these conditions, as I say, were absolutely appalling. Now, if you want some evidence, I've written down here a fact from Thomas Clarkson. Thomas Clarkson was an abolitionist, so he wanted to get rid of slavery. He did an investigation into the treatment of enslaved people. He found a slave ship called Brooks in Liverpool. Now, legally, it was allowed to carry 454 enslaved people down in the hold, down below. But it was often carrying more than 600. So again, you get the idea of how cramped this ship was. Okay, it was legally allowed to take 450 people, and it was taking 600 tied together in this, or tied down, I should say, cramped together in this hold on the ship. Now, on the journey itself, the enslaved people, as I say, were shackled, so they couldn't move, and if they resisted in any way, they would be subjected to punishments such as whipping. They would also be withheld food if they were considered to be weak or sick or dying, and many of the enslaved people actually committed suicide by jumping overboard rather than face any more of this journey or the unknown prospect of what was going to happen to them once they reached their destination. Disease and poor sanitation was a real issue on the slave ships, and it was said that the ships could be smelled with the wind as they approached the Caribbean or the Americas. It smelt so badly that the smell carried in the wind, and you could smell them before they arrived there, or the ships you could smell, I should say. Now, once slave ships arrived, the slaves were taken off the ships. They were cleaned, usually by being scrubbed very hard in order to take a layer of skin off. Okay, to make the enslaved people appear more healthy. So, because remember, they want to sell them at slave auctions. I'll talk more about this in a minute, but the enslaved people were, as I say, scrubbed to take a layer of skin off and make them appear healthier. Any wounds on the body would be filled with hot tar. Again, this was done in order, as I say, to make them appeal to prospective buyers at slave auctions. Now, here slaves would be sold. They would be sold to usually plantation owners, and the healthiest looking slaves would generally sell fairly quickly, because they would be used again on these plantations for different work that I'll talk about in a little while. The more frail slaves, or those who hadn't sold, would usually then be sold in something called Scramble auctions. We've talked about this in class. Scramble auctions. So Scramble auctions are auctions, or were auctions, where buyers would agree a flat rate per head for the slaves, so however many dollars each, and then once the price was agreed, they would grab the people the enslaved people who were being sold. Hence the scramble part. It's kind of a free for all. Just rush and grab them and take them. So most enslaved people, as I say, ended up working on plantations. Okay, I'll talk about plantations in a bit more detail now. So they were taken to work on plantations. Now remember, a plantation is a type of farm where only one kind of crop is grown. Okay, so as I say, many enslaved people were sent to work on these in America and in the West Indies. Now, everyday life on plantations could range from brutal, really horrible, to boring, to, in some cases, fairly pleasant. Okay, on certain days, of course. No enslaved person's experience was the same as another. Okay, that's one important thing to remember, that there was no kind of one-size-fits-all typical slave experience. It differed depending on who your owner was, what plantation you were on, what era or what year you lived in. No enslaved person's experience was the same, but generally it was a pretty brutal and horrible existence. That's because enslaved people had to work in very hard conditions on these plantations, usually working in the fields where they would be picking or farming the crops that were being grown, typically things like sugar, coffee, cocoa, tobacco, and cotton, of course. That is the typical job that enslaved people would carry out, work in the fields. Now the big problem for the enslaved people, or one of the big problems I should say, they have many big problems, but one of the big problems was that they were given very little food, very little water, and very little rest. Now think, when you come to school every day, think if you haven't eaten properly or drunk enough water or had a good night's sleep, think how much of an effect that has on your work. Okay, you can't concentrate, you can't focus, you feel tired, you feel groggy, you feel hungry. You will not produce your best work if you haven't eaten properly or drunk enough or slept properly. Okay, that's fairly obvious. Well, here are the enslaved people who every day are not being fed enough, not being given enough water, and not being given enough rest. And their work was very physically demanding. Okay, so they needed to eat well and sleep well and drink well in order to perform these tasks properly. So it was a double-edged sword. Not only were they being treated horribly in terms of how they were being, their living conditions and how they were being fed and treated like that, but also their working conditions were appalling. This added to their suffering, made them more tired and physically unwell. Their living conditions were poor, not just in terms of their lack of food and lack of water. Their living quarters were poor. So their living quarters were usually wooden shacks with a dirt floor. Okay, nothing fancy, nothing nice at all. The plantation houses where the plantation owners lived were very luxurious and very grand, but the slave quarters themselves were usually wooden shacks with a dirt floor. Really not very nice at all. Many enslaved people would have to sleep on the floor, and their bed would essentially just be straw and old rags. Okay, we've looked at many accounts of slave lives in class, and we've seen just how appalling some of their living conditions were. So as well as the poor living conditions and the very hard work that they had to do, there were also awful punishments that they faced and had to deal with on a daily basis. The types of punishments being handed out ranged from whipping. It could be threatening to sell your family as a punishment, particularly if you ran away. So if you were a male or female slave with children, or a wife or a husband, maybe the plantation owner would threaten to sell a member of your family as a punishment. For those who tried to run away, we looked at this in class, where the Achilles tendon would be severed, so you couldn't run away because you can barely walk anymore, let alone run. Awful punishments being handed out. Remember that while the enslaved people are working in the fields, removing the crops or farming the crops, the overseers are being paid to make sure they're working hard and aren't afraid to use the whip to encourage the enslaved people to carry on working. Not much encouragement, but you know, it's a punishment. You know, keep working or this is what you get. Horrible, horrible existence. So in terms of work, as I say, the typical jobs on a plantation will work in the field, so picking cotton from dawn when the sun comes up to night time. So you didn't work 9 to 5 or have set hours. It was literally in terms of the light. So you can imagine how long they had to work during the summer months. You know, it's summer now. The sun's coming up at about 4:30 in the morning. It's not going down really until just before 9 o'clock. So think working all that day continuously, think how hard that's going to be. And what's more, especially in the summer, think of the heat, okay? Where these crops are being grown, this sugar and cocoa and coffee and cotton, generally it needs a lot of heat and a lot of sunshine, hence why we can't grow it in Britain and many other parts of Europe. So there's the incredible heat, there's the incredibly long hours, there's the lack of food, the lack of sleep, the lack of water, the punishments. This is a brutal existence for these poor people who live and work on the plantations. Okay, so there was also, however, different kinds of work or different elements to enslaved people's work. There was domestic work. Now, domestic workers were usually treated a little bit better than field workers to an extent. Okay, so domestic workers would work in the house and generally would have much nicer living quarters. They would be given more food, or better food anyway, and they were sometimes able to travel with the plantation owner's family as well. Okay, so there were perks to their job, and actually they were quite often looked upon with some jealousy and some envy from those who worked in the field. There was a bit of a rivalry there. However, I must also add that it wasn't, you know, a completely nice existence. Of course, they are still enslaved people. They're still being forced to work. They could still be treated quite horribly. In fact, many of the female enslaved people who had to work in the house, domestic slaves, were at risk of sexual abuse by the plantation owners. So it was by no means a nice existence, but generally it was a nicer existence than the work in the field. Finally, the last thing that I'm going to talk about, drop the sheet earlier. Finally, the last thing I'm going to talk about is slave resistance. Okay, I'm going to talk about 3 examples of slave resistance that we've looked at in class, so it should be all familiar to you: the Amistad Rebellion, the Haiti Rebellion, and everyday resistance. So there was resistance from enslaved people. They did try and put up a fight and try and, you know, improve their lives. Let's start with the Amistad Rebellion. The Amistad Rebellion began when a group of enslaved people, or people who'd been captured from Africa, on board the slave ship named the Amistad, managed to free themselves on the 1st of July 1839, and they took control of the ship and tried in vain to sail back to Africa. Now, the ship itself was stopped near New York on August 24th, and the people on board, the Africans on board, were captured and imprisoned and charged with murder because they had murdered the captain of the Amistad and several of the sailors as well. So they were charged with murder, and as I say, imprisoned in America. Now, in 1841, 2 years later, they were freed after the former American president, John Quincy Adams, had argued for their freedom. So they were freed, and of the 53 Africans who'd been captured and imprisoned, 35 of them were returned to Africa, which is a happy ending for them after, you know, a pretty horrible incident. Unfortunately, the others, so obviously 35 returned, and that left 18 who didn't. Unfortunately, they either died in prison or died at sea. So not a completely happy ending, but an example of a relatively successful episode of resistance, because 35 of those African people who would have been enslaved, or who were going to be enslaved, managed to put up a fight and resist. Another famous example of enslaved people resisting is the Haiti Revolution. So in August 1791, the Haiti Revolution was led by a man called Toussaint Louverture, that's my best French accent, or pronunciation I should say, who fought against the French army who controlled Haiti, or Saint-Domingue as it was known at that point. It wasn't known as Haiti yet. Toussaint Louverture led this rebellion against the French, and quite incredibly the enslaved people managed to defeat the French army or French soldiers, and eventually won their freedom and won their independence. Haiti became an independent nation in 1804 as a result of this rebellion. So again, more another example of success, successful resistance against slave owners and slavery. Okay. Of course, there was also everyday resistance. Okay, so where people who work on enslaved people who work on the plantation put up different kinds of resistance, which included slowing down work. Okay, so how can I try and hurt my owner? Well, I'll slow down work rather than picking all the cotton I can. I'll just do it very slowly so I get less. Okay, so he gets less money. Okay, because obviously for every ounce of cotton that I pick, the more money he'll get. So if I pick less, he'll get less money, and that will hurt his profits. Feigning illness. So I'm too ill to work. I can't work. Again, you get a day off, or again, it's one less person picking the cotton or picking the coffee or cocoa or whatever it may be. So again, hurting the plantation owner's profits. Breaking tools. Again, sorry, can't work. My tools are broken, so I can't do the work that you've told me to do. Stealing as well, so pilfering fruit and vegetables if you worked on a plantation where they were grown. So again, the theft of food was quite common because, as I said earlier, the enslaved people were not fed enough. Okay, they were constantly hungry, so any opportunity to steal some food was taken by them, and rightly so, really. Also, again, if that is the crop that is being grown that will eventually be sold, for every bit of that crop that you take away, it's taking it away from the plantation owner. It's less or fewer crops that he can sell, so again, hurting his profits. One other form of everyday resistance was running away. Okay, usually this was done by the enslaved people who had been taken from Africa rather than the ones who were born in America or the Caribbean. But running away, however, if they were caught, which was usually the case, they faced severe punishments. We've looked at some of these in class. Whipping, branding. Remember, branding is where you basically have a scar burned onto you with maybe a shape or a mark that marks you out as belonging to that particular owner. Okay, so they have a brand that they will brand onto you, so if you are caught, other people in the area can see on your arm or wherever you've been branded that you belong to that plantation owner, and you'll be returned. The severing of the Achilles tendon I've talked about again, so you can't run away, you can barely walk, let alone run away, so you can still work. You'll be in tremendous pain, but you can't run away again. Being forced to work in irons for a period of time, we've heard about that one. There was a woman who tried to run away and she was forced to work in irons, basically handcuffs, for a year. Or even execution. Some enslaved people were killed for trying to run away. So I've gone through several features there of the transatlantic slave trade. As I say, I'm not going to get into abolition just yet. I'll do a video on that in the future. But there, Year 8, again, you've got your end of year exams next week. Slavery, there will be some questions about the transatlantic slave trade on your end of year exam. So I hope this has been of some use to you for your revision. Please make sure you are revising properly. As I say, I will do another video in a few weeks' time on abolition. But I hope this has been useful to you, Year 8. Good luck in the exams if I don't see you before then. Keep revising, and I will see you very soon.